So as those folks come in, and then I'm sure she'll share the recording out as well. Diana, I can't thank you enough for being with us today, for Zooming in, and for those who joined early, for being able to get a good look at your cute little dog. So I'll kick things off with just a couple quick club announcements, and then I want to provide as much time as possible to hear from you. I think Tom Dunham is on the call. On behalf of the club, I'd like to extend our thoughts and prayers on the passing of his lovely wife. Kiwanis community is here to support in any ways that we can, but do please keep Tom in your prayers. We'll share out information on the services. But as we get started, I'll read today's invocation. Bless those who mourn, that we may face each new day with hope and certainty. Apologies, my screen is getting cut off. Bless those who mourn, that we may face each day with hope and the certainty that nothing can destroy the good that has been given. May their memories become joyful, their days enriched with friendship, and their lives encircled with love. So as we get started, I'd like to welcome all of our guests today and our members. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, say hi. Roger or Laura, would you like to give a quick update on the installation of our newest Key Club?
Yeah, how about Roger go first, because he did a lot more to help with that. I don't know if he's available. Well, I can go first then. Looks like
Perfect.
We already got some photos. I don't know how he or Kelly found those photos because they were just yesterday. I had an ask out for that, but looks like they turned out really well. It was nice to have a good turnout for their installation of the new officers. Roger, well, I guess his wife, brought some amazing pasta, and all of the students brought kind of a pitch in of different sweets. They gave out some perfect attendance awards, Key Clubber of the Year award already. So I think they chartered, they got started at the beginning probably of 2023 or the end of 22, and they're already off to a real running start. So it was really nice to see, as usual, the achievements that they've already made.
Thank you. As we're extending thanks to Roger for all of his efforts, including the Key Club. Thank you, Roger, for stepping up to help Jason Burke select our East Scholarship recipients from Butler and the University of Indianapolis. Jason is looking for a few more people to do this over the next couple of weeks. Jerry East was a generous donor to our foundation, and his gift allows us to fund the football, basketball, and female athlete scholarships annually, as well as to Butler and Indy. Last week, we presented Autumn Rucker of Pike High School, the Marion County Female Athlete Award, during the Indiana High School Sports Awards at Clues. Thank you to our members that were able to join us that night and to celebrate Autumn and the other incredible athletes that were recognized. Since 2017, our foundation has awarded $24,500 to 7 athletes. Autumn will use the $3,500 scholarship at Benedictine University and plans to be a professional sports trainer. Again, thank you to the efforts of Laura Berry and Lamita Steele on the committee. Lamita was amazing on stage. She has that role as long as she wants it, as far as I'm concerned. Era Steele and Laura Holloway were also there and enjoyed their VIP sponsor access to tour Clues Hall. They got some nice behind the scenes experience. Next Thursday is May the 4th. So may the 4th be with you. It's also known as Star Wars Day. We have a meeting with the Bloodfin Garrison part of the 501st International Costumery Group, visiting us at the Columbia Club. Tomorrow night, they will also be at Victory Field for Star Wars night with the Indians. So you have a lot of opportunities to get your Star Wars in for the next few days. Leonard Hoops from Visit Indy will be joining us at the Columbia Club on Thursday, May 11th. It's not only National Tourism and Travel Week, but it's also Visit Indy's centennial year. Leonard is always a hit with the club, so please invite guests, come out. We're very excited to hear from him what's coming forward in their, I guess, second 100 years. On Thursday, May 18th, we're back on Zoom with Dana Pohl. She's the Director of Community at Uncovered. It's the nation's largest database of cold cases and a true crime podcast host. Say that a couple of times fast. We'll have no meeting on May 25th, just prior to the Indy 500 and Memorial Day. As is tradition, please feel free to join the Memorial Day celebrations downtown. And then finally, Exodus Refugee will be visiting us in June to provide a recap of the $11,000 grant that we provided them for youth programming. We're also going to mark World Refugee Day together. Roger, any quick announcements on the lunch bunch? Oh, we cannot hear Roger. Usually he sounds like a chipmunk. Today he still can't hear him. So I will lip read and tell you that the next monthly lunch bunch at Iozo's Garden of Italy is on Monday, May 15th. This is a great way to visit with Kiwanis if you're not able to make a Thursday lunch meeting. I think I read his lips correctly. If there's anything else to add, feel free to drop it in the chat. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the mic over to Graham Honecker to introduce today's speaker. I cannot wait to hear all of this. Graham?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Great to be with you. Today's world is beautiful because you can really connect with people you've never met who may live in a different area than you are. And I, a couple months ago, was watching the wonderful Netflix documentary on Bernie Madoff, and Diana was interviewed throughout. And as I'm apt to do to try to at least earn my membership here, I try to bring you decent speakers. And I thought, wow, she would be great. Now, how do I reach her? For all the flack social media gets, LinkedIn is a wonderful way to connect. And I connected, I sent her a message, thinking again, it would be much like my dating life in high school, where nobody ever returned my correspondences, but she was kind enough and said she would be honored to present to us. We're also going to record this, Diana, if it's okay, and just share it internally with our membership, and we set it up from there. But just have great respect. I'm not going to read her entire bio because we really want her to speak today, but Diana B. Henriques is an award-winning financial journalist and author of 5 books. She has specialized in investigative reporting on white-collar crime, market regulation, and corporate governance as a staff writer for the New York Times from 1989 to 2012, and as a contributing writer since then. She was a member of a Pulitzer Prize finalist team reporting on the aftermath of the Enron scandals in 2003. After the terrorist attacks of 9/11, she and Times colleague David Barstow covered the management of billions of dollars in charity and victims assistance. In 2005, her series exposing the exploitation of military personnel by financial services companies prompted legislative reform and cash reimbursements for tens of thousands of defrauded service members. As I'm reading this, we've got an audit coming up for Kiwanis. I'm hoping Diana isn't involved in that audit, just looking at the things she's covered over the years. She was a Pulitzer finalist and received a George Polk Award, Harvard's Goldsmith Prize for investigative reporting, and the Worth Bingham Prize. In 2017, HBO aired its film-length adaptation of her book, The Wizard of Lies with Robert De Niro in the starring role, and with Diana playing herself as the first journalist to interview Bernie Madoff in prison. She is currently part of the Netflix docuseries Madoff, the Monster of Wall Street. I highly recommend you watch that. And I'm going to ask Kelly if we can promote her books in the chat link as we go through here. Born in Texas, but raised mostly in Roanoke, Virginia, which I have a lot of family from. Is a beautiful area. Smith Mountain Lake, spent a lot of time there. Beautiful. She's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of what is now the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. We are really honored to have you, Diane. I know you're very busy, and this is a program many of us have been looking forward to for a while. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here. As I've told the smaller group, we are the proud owners of a brand new puppy from Indiana. So I'm a big Indiana fan at the moment. I'm glad you mentioned the Netflix series and that was what brought Graham's attention to me. I have to admit that I was skeptical when Joe Berlinger at Radical Media approached me about doing that series, which he did, oh gosh, in the middle of the pandemic. My reaction was, it's been 15 years. Madoff is dead. And if you care, you already know about him. So what's the point? But Joe was very persuasive and thought that it was worthwhile to do it. So I agreed. And the reason I agreed was it's been 15 years, which meant, as Joe pointed out, that a whole lot of 30 and 40 somethings have come of age as investors with only the barest recollection of the Madoff lessons. They were in college when he was arrested. And although he's dead, a new Ponzi scheme surfaces roughly every 5 days in this country. So there's still plenty of Madoff wannabes out there ready to prey on people who aren't alert to the Madoff lessons. And even more compelling to me it was an opportunity to address a problem, which is that even if you think you already know about Ponzi schemes, because of persistent and obsolete stereotypes, almost all that we think we know about Ponzi schemes is wrong. It's simply wrong. And the Madoff scandal illustrated how wrong it was. So I'm going to talk with you today about Ponzi schemes, about the lessons Madoff exposed about Ponzi schemes, and then suggest some just practical ways. And I'm not a financial advisor. This is just a financial journalist with 50 years of experience offering some ideas about how you can protect yourself from this persistent, chronic source of fraud. So Ponzi schemes are actually a very old form of fraud. They used to be called Peter to Paul schemes for obvious reasons. I mean, the essence of a Ponzi scheme is robbing Peter to pay Paul. And so back in the 1800s, they were common and they were known as Peter to Paul schemes. I call them the Swiss Army knife of fraud because they can be used in so many different ways. They are constantly refreshed with new scripts and new props and new costumes. We've had crypto Ponzi schemes already. We've had a multiple number of real estate Ponzi schemes. We've even had rare art and vintage wine Ponzi schemes. I mean, there's no asset class in the world that a Ponzi schemer cannot turn into a Ponzi scheme. So most of our stereotypes today, though, about Ponzi schemes are obsolete. They are rooted in the days of Charles Ponzi, who was the Italian-American entrepreneur who set up the massive Ponzi scheme in Boston. It was short-lived. It actually survived for only about 9 months and was, small change compared to many modern Ponzi schemes. But he had an interesting cover story. He alleged that he was investing in international postal certificates, and no one knew quite exactly what they were, but they sounded good, and the returns were extraordinary. 30% a month, that kind of return. Now, Charles Ponzi was a dapper, larger-than-life fellow. Look up on Google and find some old photographs of him with this straw boater and his nifty little 1920s suits. And that image the larger than life, slick snake oil salesman offering you pie in the sky, overnight wealth. That's stuck. That's our stereotype of a Ponzi scheme, and it is totally out of date. There are still occasionally Ponzi schemers like that, but they tend to be people preying on an affinity group, a group of very unsophisticated investors who, over whom they exercise control through some religious or civic or ethnic relationship. In those kinds of affinity frauds, Ponzi schemes do look a little bit more like the old-fashioned ones, but that was not Bernie Madoff, and that was not a lot of the schemes that were exposed around the time of Madoff's arrest and in the 15 years subsequently. And let me just say again, roughly every 5 to 6 days, a new Ponzi scheme surfaces. I follow them through a website called ponzitracker.com. If this is something that you're interested in, you can learn about all the multiplicity of Ponzi schemes on that wonderful website. A modern Ponzi scheme is not run by a snake oil salesman pushing sky-high returns. They are run by trusted and admired figures who are offering just enough profit to catch your interest. A fraud analyst whom I know and love, named Pat Huddleston, gave me the very best line, which I've used a million times about Bernie Madoff and Ponzi schemes. He said, if it sounds too good to be true, you're dealing with an amateur. Now, I heard a lot of you say, oh yeah, if it sounds too good to be true, you know it's a Ponzi scheme. No. If it sounds too good to be true, it's a stupid Ponzi schemer who's offering it to you. Because Bernie Madoff knew better than to make it sound too good to be true. He made it sound just good enough to be interesting, just good enough to be attractive. So that's what I hope I can convey with you. You will not see these con men coming. They will be the most, right now, since we know a Ponzi scheme surfaces in the country roughly every 5 days, there's one going on right now that we don't know about yet. But I can tell you with total confidence what the person running it is like. They are a successful, admired, probably quite generous figure in their locality. They are almost certainly a man. They are almost certainly middle-aged at least, and they command the trust of all of their investors. That's what you have to do to run a Ponzi scheme. You don't hand your retirement savings over to some shifty-eyed guy in a cheap suit. You hand it to somebody you trust. And so trust is the primary tool that a Ponzi schemer needs. Now, why so many and persistent Ponzi schemes? Well, we're coming into a period where a lot of Ponzi schemes are being exposed. And the reason for that is that the low interest rate environment and the sluggish stock markets are catnip for Ponzi schemers. They know that investors are searching for income. They're searching for a better investment than the regulated market offers them, and therefore they are vulnerable to that just good enough attractive offering. A few years ago, if I had told you, hey, listen, I've got this super safe, highly liquid, short-term bond fund, and it's paying 2.5%, that wouldn't have sounded like a Ponzi scheme to any one of you, would it? And yet, it almost certainly would have been a fraud, because the qualifying investments, highly liquid, safe, short-term, would have been treasury bills and short-term AAA corporate notes. And they were paying barely 1% at that time. So today, with T-bills paying around 4%, that Ponzi deal wouldn't get a second glance, but Ponzi schemers will adapt, just as we do, to higher rates and better market returns. They will scale up their fictional profits to match what the market is offering. One of the most intriguing bits I learned in the course of doing the original Madoff book was from an accountant who was sadly a Madoff victim, and he calculated the returns that he had gotten from his Madoff investments over the years that he invested with him, and discovered he would have made more money in the Fidelity Magellan Fund than he made with Madoff. So if your stereotype is that these are greedy investors who deserve what they got because they were looking for, something that was too good to be true, erase that. That's not real life. These were people who were looking for conservative, safe investments guided by one of the most respected men on Wall Street. So that's the real world of modern Ponzi schemes. As I said earlier, you just need two things to run a Ponzi scheme. You need people who trust you, and probably everybody on this gallery I'm looking at qualifies. And you need a bank account. You can't run a Ponzi scheme without a bank account. Now, in a better world than we have right now, in a better scheme of bank regulation than we have right now, that would be our Rosetta Stone. That would be the open sesame. That would be the charm that would wipe out Ponzi schemes. They've got to have a bank. And if the bankers are alert to what's happening in their accounts, they can crack these things down before they even rip anybody off. But they don't. And they are not required to in our current regulatory scheme. And while there have been just a handful of civil lawsuits that have been successful in victims recovering some money from the bank that facilitated the Ponzi scheme that ripped them off, that is by far the exception to the rule. Deutsche Bank just today announced that it had reached a settlement, $93 million settlement with victims of a Ponzi scheme that had ripped off a bunch of smaller businesses and corporations. But let me tell you, it was news. It was news on Reuters because it almost never happens. So banks are not pulling their weight in the fight against Ponzi schemes. And when I talk to regulators and when I talk to bank examiners, I wag my finger at them and say, you can do better than this. You should be doing better than this. If you have access to the actual cash flow in a Ponzi schemer's account, it is unmistakable. Absolutely unmistakable. So that the banks aren't going to help you. The Ponzi schemer is not going to advertise himself with some easy to recognize, red flag waving, too good to be true scheme. So you're going to have to protect yourself. And I've got a few suggestions about how to do that. One of the most reliable ways is to insist on third-party custody for your assets. Now, what does this mean? Under law, American mutual funds must use a third-party custodian. So Fidelity's Magellan Fund doesn't hold the assets that it buys for its investors. State Street Bank does, an independent third-party custodian. I think it's still State Street. Don't hold me to that. I guarantee you it's an independent bank because that's required by frankly, regulations that were adopted under FDR in 1940. So it's a good practice for mutual funds, and it's a good practice for us. So if you're dealing with a money manager, the first question you want to know is, who holds my assets? Where are they kept? And if they're not kept in the hands of a third-party custodian, I want you to think twice about that, okay? Also, I would suggest, and the current evidence is abundant, steer clear of unregulated assets. Of course, the big one in front of mind right now is crypto. Just don't. It is unregulated, and anyone going into it and expecting the protections of a modern regulation it is demented. It bothers me that U.S. regulators have allowed the crypto industry to hijack the vocabulary of regulated finance. Binance and FTX are not exchanges. They call themselves exchanges. They're not. Under U.S. law, adopted under FDR, an exchange is a regulated industry. It is a regulated entity governed by the 1934 Securities and Exchange Act. So if you're not, and they're not, then you should not be allowed to call yourself an exchange. The idea that people were making deposits with FTX, for example. No, they weren't. These weren't deposits. Deposits are something you make to a bank. So the language was hijacked and used to lend a completely inaccurate impression of the degree of regulation present in this field. So unregulated assets, run, don't walk in the other direction. But also be cautious about loosely regulated assets, by which I mean limited partnerships and real estate. While there are some regulations, and certainly fraud laws do apply to all of those transactions, unless it's a limited partnership in which you have very clear visibility, or real estate that you can monitor personally in the real world, you're taking a risk that may not be justified. And then finally, and nobody wants to hear this, and I can attest to that because I say it at family Thanksgivings and nobody wants to hear it. Don't ever invest with close family and friends. Just don't. We're hardwired as human beings to trust one another. Scientists will tell you that. There's a wonderful, wonderful book coming out from Chris Chabris and Dan Simons of Harvard. They wrote the book, The Invisible Gorilla, one of the best books on neuro nonsense I've ever read. They have a new one coming out that Nobody's Fool, it's called. And it's going to be out this summer. I've given the blurb for the jacket, so I had a chance to read it earlier. And it's a don't put down book. But they will tell you, we are hardwired to trust one another. And the more you look and sound like us, and the more successful and admirable you are, the more inclined we are to trust you. So when you're doing business with those whom you not only trust, but love, you are setting yourself up for disaster, because you will not see any red flags before it's too late. So just don't. If you must, do understand that relationships, business relationships that intersect with close personal relationships must be monitored far more carefully than those that don't. And our instinct is just the opposite, isn't it? Oh, I'm doing business with my dear, dear friend so-and-so. I don't need to watch it as closely. And just the opposite is true. You need to watch it more closely, because you are already inclined to be blinded by your trust and your affection for that person. So if you want to learn more about Ponzi schemes in general, the SEC website has a fairly good cautionary message. You can learn more about what Ponzi schemes surface and what they sound like on the ponzitracker.com website that I mentioned. And you can also read The Wizard of Lies if you'd like, or watch either the HBO movie or the incredible Netflix series, which goes into incredible depth, even more so than the movie. I mean, the movie's worth seeing because I think it's one of Robert De Niro's most compelling performances. But the Netflix series will be a deeper, broader dive into the world of Madoff than you can get in the HBO adaptation. So now I'm ready for your questions. It looks like we've left ourselves enough time for us to field Q&A. I'm not sure who's going to call on whom, how the mechanics, I guess, is what I want to know here.
We know Graham has some teed up.
I can yeah, I usually do, but I want to throw it out to the audience first. I'll be happy to moderate. So if you've got questions, chat, or you can just chime in either way. And we do have some financial gurus here. So I'm going to lean on you guys too to step up here.
Okay. Graham, I've got a question. First of all, thank you for coming today, Diana. And I'm an accountant, and I did watch it twice when it first came out on the Netflix episode. And one of the things that really amazed me is, which is typical in a lot of frauds, in a typical accounting fraud, there's always going to be a lot of red flags. And in this case, there were numerous. The gentleman from, excuse me, the investment firm in Boston put together a list of 29 red flags. And the thing that I was curious about was, why do you think that people, because some of the people that were invested with him were sophisticated, and some of them were investing in funds that didn't even know they were invested with Madoff, which is another big problem, I suppose. But Why do you think that so many people, including the SEC, ignored really obvious red flags, such as, there weren't audited statements and that you weren't allowed online access, just two ones that struck me.
Certainly, online access became a more compelling red flag in later times. When Bernie first started managing money in the late 80s, that wasn't a red flag at all because nobody had online access to their investment accounts. So yes, things changed, but that should have been more alert. I think the best answer is people knew Bernie Madoff. The sophisticated investors who invested with him directly knew him personally. Let me tell you a quick story about the late 1990s that will illustrate to you when I say it was not irrational to completely trust Bernie Madoff. Some of you may remember, although it was kind of an inside baseball scandal, but there was a huge price fixing scandal that hit the NASDAQ market in the late 90s, 1998, 99. It grew out of actually research done at Vanderbilt. A couple of business professors there analyzed NASDAQ prices and said that it was beyond random possibility that there would never be a spread between the buy and sell price on a NASDAQ stock smaller than 1/4 point. It never happened. And the chances of that being legitimate were impossible. The class action suit was brought, the Justice Department took over the class action suit, and ultimately more than 24, I think around 30 major Wall Street firms, Prudential-based, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, all of them settled nearly $1 billion settlement with the US government for fixing prices on NASDAQ stocks. Now, at the time of that lawsuit and that Justice Department action, Bernie Madoff's firm on a wholesale basis was one of the largest traders on NASDAQ stocks on any daily day. At any day's volume, he would have anywhere from 5 to 10%, just one firm, 5 to 10% of the NASDAQ trading volume. Conspicuous by his absence from the list of defendants, Bernie Madoff. And I called the lawyers, I knew the class action lawyers who had originally filed the suit on the back of the Vanderbilt research. And I said, was it like close? Did you just not have quite enough on the scale to name the Madoff firm among all these other firms? They said, not a scintilla of evidence against Madoff's firm. So if you're a regulator, you can be excused for believing that Bernie Madoff's was the only honest NASDAQ firm on the street in 1999 because he did not fix prices. Now we can look back and say, well, of course not. He couldn't have any investigators running around his firm. He was running a Ponzi scheme downstairs. And yeah, that would have been right. But the fact is he kept his trading desk on such a tight leash. They never would have dreamed of doing what the other trading desks did and were tape recorded doing and had emails proving that they'd done it. So you have to set that real lived experience that regulators had against the allegations of this squirrely little guy from Boston. I know Harry Markopolos. He is an incredible analyst. He is as close to clinically paranoid as you can get and still function in the society. He didn't trust anybody. So of course he didn't trust Bernie Madoff. And actually I've said that very statement to Harry and he thinks it's a grand compliment. So he's proud of the fact that he didn't trust anyone, but most of us don't live that way. Most of us do trust people and we decide who we're going to trust based on our lived experiences. And for regulators in Washington around the year 2000, which is when Harry Markopolos made his first attack on Madoff, you're looking at a guy that not only pulled his firm through the 1987 crash in glowing fashion, one of the only NASDAQ firms that was able to even keep its doors open on Black Monday and Black Tuesday of 1987. He was commended by the SEC for his performance for investors on that day. And you're also looking at a guy that was squeaky clean in the worst scandal to ever hit the NASDAQ. He had no regulatory dings in his record. One of the first things I did is looked up his broker track record with the SEC when I heard he'd been arrested. There were 2 tiny technical infractions over the entire life of the firm. So, of course, trusted Bernie. It was not irrational to trust him. It would have seemed irrational to not trust him. Does that help?
Yes, yeah, thanks.
Diane, I have a question.
Yeah.
Bernie's sons, did
Yeah.
they ever know anything about what his dad was doing?
Before he confessed to them?
Yes.
No. I'm convinced that they did not. And I think at this point, in the absence of evidence, we have to take that as evidence. There is no evidence whatsoever that they knew. In my book, I detail the circumstantial evidence from which I conclude that neither son nor Bernie's wife, Ruth Madoff, knew about the fraud. And it's compelling to me, but we must also look at the, at the outcome. I mean, it's been 15 years now, and no evidence has surfaced that either Mark nor Andrew knew about the fraud. The fraud operated out of another floor, as those of you who've seen the series understand. It was on the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building, and a floor below the legitimate firm, and it had a key card entry. And the trustee and the FBI and the SEC got the records of those key cards. The sons did not have access to that floor, so they had never been there. Neither had Ruth. So, that certainly, was a compelling argument. Both of them and Peter Madoff as well left virtually their entire wealth in Bernie's hands. Now, interestingly, 2 of the software coders, software designers who were convicted of working with Bernie to create the fraud, moved their money out of the firm into Fidelity in 2005, because they knew it was a fraud and they were making money with Bernie and they wanted to get it out and get it safe. Bernie's sons never moved a penny. Peter's, his brother, never moved a penny. All Peter's grandchildren's college funds were invested with Bernie. The boys had their mortgages with Bernie. So there's no evidence that they did not trust him. Moreover, we know the fraud began at least in the early 90s. I think it began in the mid 80s, probably at or around the 87 crash or immediately thereafter. The sons were still in college, so I'm kind of curious about how that conversation went when Bernie sits them down and say, delighted to have you on board, working in the family firm. By the way, we're running a Ponzi scheme downstairs. These were well-educated boys, Wharton School, Michigan educated, who could have gone to work anywhere on the street based on their father's reputation. They could have gone to work anywhere. It is inconceivable that if they knew that he was running a Ponzi scheme, they would have stayed and worked for him, even if they didn't blow the whistle on it, right? So I go at greater length in Wizard of Lies to explain why I think that they did not know. But the most compelling reason, of course, is how horrifically it upended their lives when they did learn. Mark Madoff committed suicide on the 2nd anniversary of his father's arrest. Andrew Madoff told me, he came down to talk to a class I was teaching at Princeton, right after he was diagnosed with a recurrence of the cancer that he'd had several years earlier. And he told me, he said, well, my dad's crime, it killed my brother quickly and it's killing me slowly. And he died about 6 months after that visit down to Princeton. So I don't believe that they knew. I'm confident that Ruth did not know. Bernie went to enormous pains. I mean, he was deluded to think that he could protect them from the consequences of his crime. I mean, I talked with him when I interviewed him in prison, and I said, Bernie, if you'd been hit by a bus, not an uncommon activity in New York City, if you'd been hit by a bus one afternoon, what did you think was going to happen? Will your sons inherit the firm? They're going to find out what's going on. I said, what? Oh, no. He said he was convinced he had quarantined them from the fraud. that they would somehow be protected from the fraud, which was, of course, just absolutely delusional. But that was his belief, that he had kept it a secret from them and thereby protected them from the consequences of it.
Diana, a follow-up. As I watched the film, the Netflix documentary series, the interviews with Madoff, I think they were conducted in jail, maybe around 2015, 2016. He seemed completely emotionless to me. I mean, and maybe that was just the time and the place, but he seemed completely remorseless. It just didn't. I mean, I'm not a psychologist. I'm married to one though, and it fit to me the description of a sociopath who didn't have emotion around it.
The one caveat, I actually, when the Madoff book first came out, I did an interesting visit with the psychiatric staff at Mount Sinai Hospital as part of their grand rounds. They brought me in, and I think they sort of wanted to psychoanalyze Bernie Madoff by proxy because they hadn't met him and I had, and they had all kinds of questions like that for me. And the one thing that gave them pause was my description of his expressions of feelings for his family. Now, one very strong and opinionated chap made the case that Bernie used his family to feed his own ego, that this wasn't genuine affection that he was expressing for them. They were the audience for his performance as the Wizard of Wall Street. That, you know, that he needed their adulation and he fed on that adulation, and it wasn't reciprocal affection. I don't know. I mean, people who worked at the firm recalled every time Bernie had been traveling or one of the sons had been traveling, they always greeted each other with hugs and kisses when they returned to the trading floor. I mean, there were obvious signs of open affection. So it's hard to say whether he's, you know, genuinely clicks all the boxes of sociopath. But what I did see is a hardening of his attitude towards his investors over the years that he was in prison. When I first interviewed him, let's see, in August of 2010. So he'd been in prison for a little over a year at that point. He'd gone into that particular prison in North Carolina in June of 2009. And he said all the right words. He was never a very flamboyantly emotional person. I'd known him on the street for 15 years before he was arrested. I'd been at conferences. I'd seen him speak at round tables. He'd appeared before the SEC, testified before Congress. He was always a very, evenly modulated, unemotional, matter-of-fact person. And that's how he presented in my first prison interview with him. The second interview I did with him was 2 months after Mark's suicide, and he was a wreck. He was poorly shaven. He missed a spot shaving. This is a guy who was a dandy. I mean, absolutely, always turned out. When I interviewed him the first time, his prison uniform was perfectly pressed and little crisp, sharp edges, creases down the sleeves, and a shiny breast. But belt buckle, shiny leather sneakers. I mean, he just always perfectly turned out, even in prison. But on that occasion, in February of 2011, he was a wreck, rumpled. His shirt was actually wrongly buttoned. He'd missed misbuttoned the shirt. But he still would not talk about Mark at all. Completely shut down about that topic. So obviously a complex man. I think of him kind of as a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde figure, that there was this warm and personable family man who was readily visible to his friends and acquaintances on the street. And then there was the guy that could, look a widow in the eye and tell her she'd be fine while he is stealing her husband's money. So I don't know what we can make of people like that. His explanation for himself was that he always tried to please people too much, And so he didn't want to tell people the bad news, I've lost your money, or you didn't make money this month. He always was trying to make people feel good about their investments. You know, obviously he was always trying to look good to them, but also that he had this superlative superpower of compartmentalization, that he could keep his life in airtight compartments. There was a weekend, and they depict it, I think, in the Netflix series, I believe, where he's given the SEC his depository trust company account number. They, for all he knows, are absolutely certainly going to call the DTC and find out that there's nowhere near the amount of assets in that DTC account that there should be, given how much money he is managing. He goes home, he spends the weekend in Montauk and waits for the axe to fall. They don't call the DTC. They get deflected on other issues, and that opportunity to explode the fraud is missed. But Bernie just sat calmly and waited it out. And when nothing happened, he went on his way and continued the fraud. So we're dealing with someone who clearly has, you know, ice water in his veins, who is cool and calm and calculated, and somehow was able to insulate himself from the shame. I mean, you're ripping off Elie Wiesel, from the fear of constant exposure. So sociopath is as close as I can get to a label for that.
I have a question about the amount of earnings that he was reporting consistently year after year. And no other investment person that I've ever seen can do that. Wasn't that a giveaway that he was cooking the books?
Well, I wish it had been, but it wasn't. And here's why. The strategy he claimed to be pursuing, which is sometimes called a bull spread or a bull collar. He called it the split strike conversion strategy, but it utilizes options on the to limit your risk on the downside, which also caps your return on the upside within a collar. You know, based on what price you go, where you price the options. You know that your returns are going to fluctuate within that band, because if they go higher than that, you're going to spend more for the options to protect you. If they go lower than that, the options are going to restore that lost money and keep your returns within that band. So, you know, for sophisticated investors, they understood how that worked, and it wasn't so mysterious. If people say, well, why aren't your returns as volatile as the Magellan Fund returns, for example? He said, because I managed to avoid that. I am managing the money specifically to achieve those consistent returns. And the fact is, there was a regulated mutual fund, the Gateway Fund, that launched in the early 80s, pursuing exactly the same strategy, a bull spread. And I was able to unearth it changed its strategy. And with Morningstar, when they changed their strategy, Morningstar deep sixes all their previous records, but I was able to unearth that fund's records for the Madoff book. And I'll be darned, they look pretty close to Bernie's. Nice, consistent returns. Now, around the 87 crash, 86, 87, 88, that fund fell apart. The volatility in the market just made it impossible for it to sustain, and it eventually dropped that strategy, changed its strategy completely, and went on its way. Which is why I think that's when Bernie went from a potentially legitimate investment fund to a Ponzi scheme, because he couldn't make the legitimate investment work anymore. So, I mean, that's one example of those things that in hindsight you say, oh God, why didn't anybody figure that out? But at the time, there were plausible explanations that even sophisticated investors accepted and could understand.
We've got time for maybe one or two more questions.
Did he express any remorse when you last interviewed him?
No.
Yeah.
My last conversation with him, I interviewed him twice. So there were 2 prison interviews, but we remained in email and telephone contact for years. My last conversation with him was while the HBO film was being made. So it was the summer of 2015. And at that point, he was furious with the trustee, the Madoff trustee, who was liquidating the firm and gathering assets for his victims, and complained to me. He said, that these investors had no basis for complaint because they'd made a lot of money with him over the years, and now they were all being made whole by the trustee, which is just blatantly false. And I called him on it, and I said, that's not true. That is not true. They're getting back and is the cash they gave you. All of the profits they believed that they were earning are gone. And people had to drop out of college, sell a family home. You can't put that back together again. No. But we had a big argument about it, and I wasn't interested in pursuing it again, and he wasn't interested in trying to persuade me that he was blameless in this instance. So that was the end point of a continuum, Bill. That he started out saying the right words, although without convincing emotional impact behind it. By the end of my conversations with him, he didn't even bother with the right words. They should have known, the banks should have known, the investors were lucky, they made a lot of money on me over the years, and now the trustees getting their money back for them.
Yeah, that's been my experience with representing white collar criminals.
Yeah,
is that they're upset that they got caught, but the fact was that at the end of the day, they deserved it because I deserved it.
Yeah.
And it's amazing that psychic of walking through that and listening to people justify their actions when you know that it's absolutely wrong, and yet it doesn't click for you. It doesn't. You and I would click, but they don't click that. There's just something missing.
There is
Great
something
book,
missing.
Great book.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Can I take just a second before we go to push my new book, Graham? While we have a little
as a
bit
fellow author who's done this many times on this call, you are promote away.
My latest book, A Labor of Love, that's taken more than 5 years in the midst of the pandemic and everything else, will be out on September 12th. It's called Taming the Street: The Old Guard, the New Deal, and FDR's Fight to Regulate American Capitalism. And it focuses on exclusively that part of Franklin Roosevelt's biography, his financial reforms, and what it took to put them in place and make them effective. The book opens with the 1929 crash. It closes when William O. Douglas goes on the Supreme Court in the spring of 1939. And it covers that decade of financial reform in the life of the New Deal. I had a ball writing it. I absolutely loved it. I tell the story by weaving together the lives of those 4 men: Franklin Roosevelt, Joe Kennedy, the first chairman of the SEC, William O. Douglas, the third and most consequential chairman of the SEC, and Richard Whitney, the president of the New York Stock Exchange, who was determined to fight Roosevelt to the last ditch over these rules and wound up in prison as an embezzler. So it's a lively tale. I've had a ball writing it. I think you'll find it a lot of fun, and it will be out September 12th from Random House. You can pre-order it now on Amazon. I think that's the complete public service announcement.
Well, I'm gonna ask everyone to Diana's doing this on her own time and didn't charge us anything. And I think the least we can do is get on Amazon and support her books. I hope you will do that. I know Trina's got a presentation, but I get to ask the last question because I'm moderating. In maybe 30 seconds, because I want to end, on time. Mrs. Madoff, just an update on where she is. I mean, if you think about the toll, the financial toll, but losing 2 of her sons, obviously
husband,
losing
all
her
her
husband,
friends.
like I don't know how a person there was a rumor that she and Bernie were going to make a suicide pact. I don't know if that was true or not, but
She
just-
did. They did attempt suicide on Christmas Eve of 2008. Unsuccessfully. They used Ambien, and Ambien will only kill you if you drink with it. And she was careful not to drink because she was afraid they would throw up, and they didn't have any more Ambien. So it left them with terrible gastrointestinal problems and terrible nightmares, and still alive. I don't know how she gets out of bed every day, but she does. She is deeply and beautifully supported by her grandchildren. When I was interviewing her at her sister's home in Florida, in the course of a 5-hour interview, one of her grandsons in school out in Colorado called her 3 times to be sure she was okay. So, I mean, so there is a loving set of grandchildren who have taken her in and made sure that she is safe and loved. And she has finally, literally just maybe a year and a half ago, the trustee finally reached a financial settlement with her, that she's been living on an allowance from the trustee. She is homeless. She does not own a piece of property. She owns her car and her personal belongings. But she has been able to house sit in friends' homes and have a place to live. She could not rent an apartment in Manhattan. No one would rent to her because of the fear of the paparazzi who were hounding her everywhere. She was fired by her hairdresser, who didn't want her to come back because so many of his other customers were among her husband's victims. And as you say, she lost both of her sons and her husband and all of her friends. He ripped off their entire family. Her sister and brother-in-law lost everything they had, invested with Bernie. And yet they took her in when she had to leave the New York apartment. She is a person of incredible strength, obviously. Very plain spoken, down to earth, a very earthy sense of humor. She is a housewife of a certain era. She's about 8 to 10 years older than I am. And many of the older people in my family are of that vintage. In her world, the husband took care of all the business world and finances, and she raised the family. And that was her world. And it never occurred to her that Bernie wasn't what she thought he was. So she is a person I pray for daily, because I just don't know where she gets the strength to keep going, but she does.
Well, a tragic American tale that you have chronicled beautifully. We can't thank you enough. I really appreciate you returning my correspondence. We're going to support your books, and I'm going to turn it back over to our president for a special presentation here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I hope you will continue to answer our emails and say yes when we invite you back to speak on your new book. That one,
absolutely. I can guarantee that. Thanks very much.
Pre-order that. So thank you again for taking the time to join us, to share all of your work with us. And in recognition of you spending time with us today, we're making a donation in your name to New Shoe Day. They provide support and partner with organizations in the effort to fight the mental health crisis, particularly among youth and populations most at risk of adverse health outcomes. So with that, please mark your calendars for next Thursday. We'll be back in person at the Columbia Club celebrating May the 4th with Star Wars Day. It'll be a fun, lively program. And with that, meeting is adjourned. Feel free to hang out and visit.